The setting sun cast long shadows across the Double W Ranch, painting the weathered fence posts in shades of amber and gold. Martha Whitaker stood on her front porch, her keen eyes scanning the horizon with an intensity that seemed out of place on her seemingly gentle face. Her hand, calloused from years of ranch work, rested casually near the worn revolver at her hip. To anyone passing by, she appeared to be nothing more than another struggling widow trying to keep her late husband's dream alive. The local folks whispered about how she'd never manage, how the Double W would soon be just another failed homestead. But there was something in Martha's stance, in the way she watched the distant tree line, that spoke of deeper mysteries. The ranch hands were bringing in the cattle for the night, their shouts echoing across the pasture. Among them was Elias "Dusty" McGraw, his weather-beaten face creased with concern as he noticed Martha's vigilant posture. He'd worked the Double W long enough to know when something wasn't right. That's when they appeared. 3 riders on the ridge, their silhouettes stark against the dying light. Even from this distance, Martha recognized their leader, Jedediah "Snake" Rawlins, his signature black duster rippling in the evening breeze. The notorious rustler had been working his way through the territory, leaving broken dreams and empty pastures in his wake. Martha's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in her eyes, a dangerous glint that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew the helpless widow. She watched as the riders studied her ranch, their horses pawing restlessly at the ground. Jedediah's reputation preceded him. 12 ranches hit in the past month alone, each one carefully chosen for its apparent vulnerability. "Mrs. Whitaker," Dusty called out, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Them's Rawlins boys up there." Martha nodded slightly, her voice steady when she replied, "I know, Dusty. Seems we've caught their eye." The riders lingered, their intentions clear in every shifting movement. Martha could almost hear their conversation. Another easy target, a widow who couldn't possibly defend what was hers. They had no way of knowing that beneath her simple appearance lay a past that would shake their confidence to its core. As darkness began to creep across the land, the riders finally turned away, disappearing beyond the ridge. But Martha knew this was just the beginning. They would be back, and when they came, they'd learn that some things in this world aren't quite what they seem. "Dusty," she called out, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. "Double the night watch. Something tells me we're in for some interesting times ahead." If you're enjoying the story of a widow with a mysterious past, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever met someone who turned out to be more than they appeared. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The moon hung low over the Double W Ranch, casting silver shadows across the sleeping cattle. Martha sat in her darkened kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her as she listened to the night. Years of training had taught her to notice the smallest changes in her surroundings. The way the crickets suddenly fell silent, how the night birds stopped their calling. Something was wrong. She moved silently to the window, her movements fluid and practiced. In the distance, she caught the glint of metal, rifle barrels reflecting moonlight. At least 6 men, maybe more, spread out along the eastern fence line where the cattle were most vulnerable. Martha's hands moved swiftly, checking her revolver with practiced efficiency. This wasn't the first time she'd faced danger in the dark, though those days were supposed to be behind her. She slipped out the back door, keeping to the shadows as she made her way to the barn. "Mrs. Whitaker!" Dusty's urgent whisper caught her attention. He was crouched behind the water trough, rifle ready. "I count 8 of them, ma'am. Rawlins is leading them himself." Martha nodded, her mind already calculating angles and positions. "They're expecting an easy night's work, Dusty. Let's show them otherwise." The Rustlers made their move just before midnight. They cut the fence with practiced efficiency, their movements suggesting years of experience. Jedediah "Snake" Rawlins led from the front, his confidence evident in every gesture as he directed his men toward the sleeping herd. That's when Martha sprang her trap. The first warning shot kicked up dirt at Rollins' feet, freezing him in place. Before his men could react, more shots rang out from different positions around the ranch, creating the impression of a much larger defending force. "That's far enough, Mr. Rollins," Martha's voice cut through the darkness, steady and commanding. She stepped into view, her rifle trained on the rustler's chest. "I believe you've mistaken my hospitality for weakness." Jedediah's face twisted into a snarl. Well, well, the widow's got teeth. He spat on the ground, his hand hovering near his gun. "You sure you want to play this game, lady?" "Might get mighty dangerous for a woman alone." Martha's laugh was cold and sharp as steel. "Funny thing about assumptions, Mr. Rollins. They have a way of getting people killed." The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. One of Rollins' men, young and foolish, went for his gun. Before he could clear leather, Martha's shot knocked it from his hand with deadly precision. "Next one won't be so generous," she warned, her aim never wavering from Rollins. The rustler's eyes narrowed, reassessing the situation. This wasn't the helpless widow he'd expected to find. There was something in her stance, in the way she handled herself, that spoke of professional training. "Fall back!" he ordered, his voice tight with fury. As his men retreated, he pointed a finger at Martha. "This ain't over, woman. Not by a long shot." Martha watched them ride away, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. Beside her, Dusty let out a low whistle. "Ma'am, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but that wasn't any ordinary rancher's shooting I just saw." "No, Dusty," Martha replied softly, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I suppose it wasn't." The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Martha's study, illuminating a hidden compartment she'd just opened beneath the floorboards. Inside lay a worn leather case, its contents untouched for nearly 2 years. With careful hands, she lifted out a silver badge, the distinctive emblem of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, gleaming in the early light. "Margaret Maggie Lane," she whispered, tracing the name engraved on an accompanying identification card. It had been her cover name, one of many she'd used during her years as an undercover operative. Memories flooded back, sharp and clear as mountain water. She remembered the smoke-filled saloons where she'd gathered intelligence, the high-stakes poker games where she'd identified train robbers, the dangerous missions that had earned her a reputation as one of Alan Pinkerton's most effective agents. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, quickly tucking the badge away. Dusty entered, his expression troubled. "Ma'am, about last night." He began, then stopped short as he caught sight of the partially hidden case. Martha saw the question in his eyes and made a decision. After what he'd witnessed, she owed him some truth. "Sit down, Dusty," she said, gesturing to a nearby chair. "There's something you should know about who I was before I came here." She pulled out an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Pinkerton Agent Breaks Carson City Gold Theft Ring." Below was a photograph of a younger Martha, though her face was partially obscured. "I spent 12 years with the Pinkertons," she explained, her voice taking on a tone Dusty had never heard before. Professional, sharp, sophisticated. Specialized in undercover work, particularly in cases involving organized criminal operations. Dusty's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "That's how you knew exactly where to position us last night. How you made 8 defenders sound like 20. Martha nodded, a faint smile playing at her lips. "The agency taught me more than just shooting. They taught me strategy, observation, the art of making people see what you want them to see." She stood pacing the room as she continued her story. "I met Thomas, my husband, during my last case. He was different, saw past all my covers, right to who I really was. When he asked me to marry him, to help him run this ranch, I thought I could leave that life behind." Her voice caught slightly. "After he died, I convinced myself I could just be Martha Whitaker, the widow rancher. But some skills, some instincts, they never leave you." Dusty leaned forward, his weathered face serious. "Ma'am, why are you telling me this? "Because Rollins isn't going to stop," she replied, her expression hardening. "And I need someone I can trust, someone who understands what we're really dealing with." She reached into the case one last time, pulling out a small notebook filled with coded entries. "I've been watching Rollins' operation for months now. His patterns, his contacts, his weaknesses. It's time to put those skills to use again." "You're going after them?" Dusty asked, both concern and admiration in his voice. Martha's eyes held a dangerous gleam. "No, Dusty. I'm going to make them come to us. And this time, they'll learn exactly who they're dealing with." The Silver Dollar Saloon hummed with the usual afternoon crowd, ranch hands drowning their dusty throats, card players hunched over worn tables, and in the corner, a group of Rollins men drinking away their wounded pride from the previous night's failed raid. Martha pushed through the swinging doors, but she wasn't Martha anymore. She'd transformed herself with the skill of years of undercover work. A different way of walking, shoulders slightly slouched, hair styled differently. She became Sarah Collins, a wandering widow looking for work as a cook. Sadie Blackwell, the saloon owner, caught her eye from behind the bar. They'd never met, but Martha had done her research. Sadie knew everyone's secrets in this town, played all sides while keeping her own counsel. That made her valuable and dangerous. "What can I get you?" Sadie asked as Martha approached the bar, her voice neutral but her eyes sharp and assessing. "Whiskey," Martha replied, letting a slight tremor enter her voice, "and maybe some information about work. I heard the Double W Ranch might be hiring, but after what happened last night—" She left the sentence hanging, watching the reaction ripple through the room. At a nearby table, one of Rollins' men shifted uncomfortably. "Wouldn't waste your time there," he growled. "That place won't be standing much longer." Martha clutched her glass tighter, playing the role of a nervous stranger. "What do you mean? I heard it was just a widow running it." A harsh laugh came from another corner. "That widow's got more fight than she knows what's good for her. But the boss has plans for that place, big plans." Sadie moved closer, wiping the bar with practiced motions. "Careful with that kind of talk," she warned, her voice low. "Walls have ears." The afternoon wore on, and Martha nursed her drink while gathering pieces of information. She learned that Rollins had a meeting planned with someone important, someone who could handle the legal side of things. She caught snippets about a larger operation, something about using the Double W's location for more than just cattle rustling. As the sun began to set, Sadie approached Martha again. "You're not really looking for work, are you?" she whispered, her eyes knowing. Martha met her gaze steadily. "What makes you say that?" "Because I know who you are, Mrs. Whitaker. Or should I say, Agent Lane." Martha's hand moved imperceptibly closer to her hidden derringer, but Sadie shook her head. "Don't worry, your secret's safe with me. I've got no love for Rollins or his kind. In fact—" She slipped a folded paper across the bar. "You might find this interesting. List of his regular buyers, including some surprising names." "Why help me?" Martha asked, carefully pocketing the paper. Sadie's face hardened. "Because 10 years ago, rustlers like him killed my husband. I've been waiting for someone with the spine to stand up to them. Just be careful. Rollins has friends in high places, very high places." Martha nodded, understanding the warning. As she left the saloon, she could feel the weight of that folded paper, knowing it could change everything. But first, she needed to verify Sadie's information and prepare for whatever storm was coming her way. The early morning mist clung to the Double W Ranch as Martha led Dusty to a secluded clearing behind the barn. Her boots left clear prints in the dew-covered grass as she carried a wooden crate filled with various items that had been hidden away since her Pinkerton days. "First lesson," she said, laying out an assortment of tools, lockpicks, wire, and small mechanisms that Dusty had never seen before. "A ranch hand needs to know more than just how to mend fences. We're going to make this place a fortress, but not in the way they'll expect." Over the next hours, Martha revealed the depth of her expertise. She showed Dusty how to set up tripwires that would alert them to intruders, how to create hidden observation posts, and most importantly, how to think like their opponents. "See this ridge here?" She pointed to the eastern slope. "They'll try to use it for cover, but if we place mirrors here and here, the morning sun will blind anyone trying to watch us from that position." Dusty absorbed everything, his respect for his employer growing with each passing moment. "Where did you learn all this, ma'am?" Martha paused, a distant look in her eyes. "Chicago, 68. We were tracking a gang that had been hitting banks across 3 states. I learned that sometimes the best defense isn't the most obvious one." As the sun climbed higher, they moved on to combat training. Martha demonstrated techniques that seemed to defy her modest appearance, ways to disarm an opponent, how to turn everyday ranch tools into weapons, and most importantly, how to read a situation before it turned violent. "Watch my stance," she instructed, moving through a series of fluid motions. "Balance is everything. The moment you lose it, you've lost the fight." She threw a punch that stopped just short of Dusty's jaw, making him flinch. "See? You were watching my hands, not my feet." They worked through the afternoon, transforming the ranch into a carefully planned defensive position. Martha showed him how to create safe routes for quick escape, how to set up signals between different parts of the property, and where to cache emergency supplies. "Remember," she said as they finished securing the last of their preparations, "Rawlins and his men will be looking for obvious defenses. Armed men, barricades, the usual. They won't be expecting this kind of sophistication." Dusty wiped the sweat from his brow, looking around at their handiwork with newfound appreciation. "You really think they'll come back in force?" Martha's expression hardened. "They have to. After last night, Rawlins can't afford to look weak, but when they come..." She checked the action on her revolver with practiced ease. "They'll find we're ready for them." As evening approached, Martha stood on her porch, surveying their work. Nothing looked obviously different about the ranch, but she knew better. Every approach was now covered, every possible advantage accounted for. She'd turned the double W into a trap, waiting to be sprung. "We're as ready as we'll ever be," she muttered, more to herself than to Dusty. "Now we wait." The attack came 3 nights later, during the darkest hour before dawn. Martha was awake instantly at the first subtle signal, a small bell, carefully placed, ringing in the distance. Through her window, she caught the movement of dark shapes against the starlit sky. This time, they weren't being subtle. Caleb Crow Thatcher led the charge, his massive frame unmistakable even in the darkness. Rawlins' right-hand man had a reputation for brutality that made his boss seem gentle by comparison. Behind him rode at least 15 men, their intentions clear in the way they spread out to surround the ranch. "Just like you said they would, ma'am," Dusty whispered from his position near the barn. "Coming in from all sides." Martha's voice crackled through the hidden speaking tube they'd installed. "Let them get closer. Wait for my signal." The raiders approached confidently, clearly expecting to find the ranch as vulnerable as before. The first trap was triggered when one of their horses stepped on a carefully concealed pressure plate. A cascade of noise erupted from the opposite side of the property, pots and pans crashing together, creating the illusion of chaos. "Check it out!" Crow bellowed, sending 3 men toward the sound. They rode straight into Martha's second trap, a series of nearly invisible wires that sent their horses stumbling, throwing their riders hard to the ground. Martha's voice rang out in the darkness. "That's far enough, Mr. Thatcher. Your men might want to consider their next move very carefully." Crow's response was a roar of rage and a signal to his remaining men. They charged forward, guns blazing, but Martha was ready. The carefully positioned mirrors she'd set up caught the light from their own lanterns, momentarily blinding them. In that instant of confusion, she and Dusty opened fire from multiple positions. "It's a trap!" someone yelled, but it was too late. The raiders found themselves caught in a crossfire, unable to tell how many defenders they were facing. Martha's Pinkerton training showed in every shot, precise, calculated, aimed to disable rather than kill. Crow, however, wasn't so easily deterred. He spotted Martha's position and charged, his huge frame somehow staying mounted despite the chaos around him. "I'm going to enjoy this, woman," he shouted, raising his rifle. Martha waited until the last possible moment before triggering her final trap. The ground beneath Crow's horse suddenly gave way, not enough to hurt the animal, but sufficient to throw off its stride. The massive outlaw was pitched forward, landing hard in the dirt. Before he could recover, Martha was there, her boot pressing firmly on his gun hand. "Tell Rollins," she said, her voice cold as winter steel, "that next time I won't be so merciful." Crow looked up at her, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. He saw something in her stance, in the professional way she held her weapon, that told him this was no ordinary rancher. The remaining raiders retreated, carrying their wounded. As they disappeared into the night, Dusty approached Martha. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "Yes," Martha agreed, watching Crow's limping figure vanish into the darkness. "But next time, they'll be desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." The morning after the raid, Sheriff Tobias read Calloway's arrival at the Double W was heralded by a cloud of dust from the main road. Martha watched his approach from her porch, noting how his badge caught the sunlight, a flash of authority meant to intimidate. She knew his type from her Pinkerton days, men who wore the law like a convenient coat, taking it off whenever something more profitable came along. "Mrs. Whitaker?" he called out, dismounting with practiced ease. His red hair, the source of his nickname, blazed like copper in the morning sun. "Heard there was quite a disturbance out here last night." Martha kept her expression neutral, offering the expected look of a concerned widow. "Nothing we couldn't handle, Sheriff. Just some troublemakers who thought they'd try their luck." Calloway's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the property, taking in the signs of the previous night's battle. "Troublemakers, you say? Funny, most widows I know would be terrified of such an encounter. Yet here you stand, calm as a summer morning." He moved closer, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. "In fact, word is, you and your man Dusty held off quite a force. That's impressive shooting for a rancher's widow." "My late husband was an excellent teacher," Martha replied smoothly, watching how the sheriff's hand rested near his gun. Not a threat, but a reminder of his authority. "Was he now?" Calloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitaker, did your husband also teach you Pinkerton tactics? Because those traps are out there." He gestured to the disturbed ground where Crow had fallen. "That's not rancher's work." Martha felt the shift in the conversation, the subtle probe for information. She'd seen it countless times during her own investigations. "I'm not sure what you mean, Sheriff. We simply defend what's ours." Of course," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "It's just that Jedediah Rollins is a powerful man in these parts, has friends in high places, would hate to see anything. Unfortunately happened to your lovely ranch because of a misunderstanding." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Martha met his gaze steadily, remembering the list Sadie had given her. She wondered if the sheriff's name was on it. "Is that a warning or a threat, Sheriff Calloway?" His laugh was sharp and hollow. "Just friendly advice from your local law enforcement. These are dangerous times for those who don't know their place." As he mounted his horse to leave, he turned back one last time. "Oh, and Mrs. Whitaker, if you happen to remember anything about those troublemakers, you be sure to let me know. It's my duty to investigate such matters thoroughly." Martha watched him ride away, her mind already working through the implications. The sheriff's visit confirmed what she'd suspected. Rollins' influence reached deeper than simple cattle rustling. The law itself was compromised. "Dusty," she called out, knowing he'd been listening from the barn. "I believe it's time to put our contingency plan into action. Things are about to get very interesting." The saloon's back room was thick with cigar smoke as Jedediah Rollins faced Sheriff Calloway across a scarred wooden table. Crow stood in the corner, his bandaged head and bruised pride making him look more menacing than usual. "A widow," Rollins spat, slamming his fist on the table. "A goddamn widow made fools of my best men, twice." He turned to Crow. "You said it was like fighting ghosts, that she knew every move before you made it." Calloway took a long draw from his cigar, letting the smoke curl around his words. "That's because she's no ordinary widow. My sources finally came through. Martha Whitaker? She used to be Margaret Lane, one of the Pinkerton agency's top operatives." The revelation landed like a thunderbolt. Rollins leaned forward, his eyes glinting with dangerous interest. "A Pinkerton? Are you sure?" "Worked for them for 12 years, Calloway confirmed. "Specialized in taking down organized operations just like yours. Then she married Thomas Whitaker and disappeared from the agency's records." Crow shifted in his corner. "That explains the traps, the tactics. We weren't fighting some lucky rancher's widow. We were up against a trained agent." Rollins stood, pacing the room like a caged wolf. "This changes everything. We can't just rush in again. She'll be expecting that." He stopped, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "But maybe we can use this information against her." "Already ahead of you," Calloway said, pulling out a folded document. "Official warrant for her arrest, charges of harboring known criminals and interfering with a lawful investigation. Once I serve this, we can search every inch of that ranch, legally. And if we happen to find evidence linking her to other crimes—" Rollins' smile widened. "Well, that would be unfortunate for the widow, wouldn't it?" Crow pushed off from his corner. "What about her Pinkerton connections?" "They might come looking if she disappears." "She left them years ago," Calloway dismissed. "Besides, by the time anyone starts asking questions, that ranch will be legally mine through foreclosure. Just another sad case of a widow who couldn't manage her property." Rollins nodded slowly, appreciating the plan's elegance. "When do we move?" "Tomorrow morning," Calloway decided. "I'll ride out with official papers. While she's distracted, your men can get into position. This time, we do it by the book, at least where anyone can see." "And if she resists?" Crow asked, his hand unconsciously touching his bandaged head. Rollins' eyes turned cold. "Then she'll learn what happens to those who stand in our way. Pinkerton or not, she's still just one woman." The three men spent the next hour refining their plan, unaware that in the shadows above them, through a carefully concealed vent, Sadie Blackwell was recording every word. The saloon owner's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, knowing this information had to reach Martha before sunrise. The pieces were set, the trap was ready, but the question remained: who was really hunting whom? Dawn hadn't yet broken when Sadie's warning reached the Double W Ranch. Martha stood in her study, reading the hastily scrawled note by lamplight, her expression hardening with each line. So, they knew her past. The game was changing, but perhaps not in the way Rollins and Calloway expected. "They're coming with a warrant," she told Dusty, who stood anxiously by the door. "The sheriff plans to use the law as a weapon, search the ranch under official pretenses while Rollins' men move into position." "What do we do?" Dusty asked, his hand instinctively checking his gun belt. Martha's mind was already racing through scenarios, drawing on years of Pinkerton experience. "We play their game, but we play it better. Dusty, remember those documents we prepared? It's time to put them to use." The sun was climbing over the horizon when Sheriff Calloway approached the ranch, his badge gleaming importantly on his chest. Two deputies flanked him, trying to look official, but Martha's trained eye caught their nervousness. Behind them, dust clouds in the distance betrayed the movement of Rollins' men taking up hidden positions. "Mrs. Whitaker," Calloway called out, his voice carrying artificial authority, "I have a warrant here requiring your immediate cooperation." Martha stepped onto her porch, the perfect picture of confused innocence. "A warrant, Sheriff? Whatever for?" "Accusations of harboring criminals and interfering with official investigations." He unfurled the document with flourish. "We'll need to search the entire property." Martha's response caught him off guard. "Of course, Sheriff. I'd expect nothing less from our diligent law enforcement." She gestured welcomingly. "Though I should mention, the federal marshals might want to see that warrant as well." Calloway's step faltered. "Federal marshals?" "Oh yes," Martha continued casually. "They arrived last night. Something about investigating corruption in local law enforcement. They're particularly interested in certain business arrangements between cattle rustlers and local officials." The color drained from Calloway's face. "You're bluffing," he managed, but his voice had lost its authority. Martha smiled, the expression reminiscent of her Pinkerton days. "Am I? Perhaps you should ask your friend Mr. Rawlins about the documents I recovered during his last failed raid. The ones detailing every transaction, every bribe, every corrupt deal. I may have been out of the agency for years, Sheriff, but I never lost my instinct for gathering evidence." The deputies exchanged uncertain glances. In the distance, a horse whinnied nervously, betraying the position of Rawlins' hidden men. "Now," Martha continued, her voice steel wrapped in silk, "we can do this one of two ways. You can turn around, take your warrant, and rethink your allegiances, or we can wait for the marshals to return and have a very interesting conversation about law enforcement in this territory." Calloway's hand twitched near his gun, desperation warring with self-preservation in his eyes. "You've just signed your death warrant, woman," he growled, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "No, Sheriff," Martha replied calmly. "I believe I've just started cleaning up this county." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Calloway backed his horse away from the porch. Martha knew this wasn't over. Men like him and Rawlins wouldn't retreat for long. She'd forced their hand, and now they'd come at her with everything they had. She didn't have to wait long. The attack began just as the sun reached its peak. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, bullets splintering wood and shattering windows. Rawlins had brought his entire gang, at least 20 men, all determined to end this once and for all. "Now, Dusty!" Martha shouted, diving for cover as she drew both her revolvers. The ranch suddenly came alive with defensive measures they'd prepared. Smoke bombs hidden in strategic locations obscured the attackers' vision, while carefully placed mirrors reflected the harsh sunlight into their eyes. Martha moved like a ghost through her own property, years of Pinkerton training taking over. She dropped 2 men with precise shots to their shoulders before they even knew she was there. Dusty held his position in the barn's hayloft, his rifle cracking steadily, keeping the attackers from grouping together. "Burn it down!" Rawlins' voice bellowed from somewhere in the chaos. "Burn everything!" Flaming arrows arched through the sky, but Martha had prepared for this too. The roof had been soaked with water before dawn, and strategic fire breaks had been dug days ago. Still, some arrows found their marks and small fires began to spread. Martha spotted Crow trying to flank her position. Without hesitation, she rolled to new cover, came up shooting, and caught him in the leg. His howl of pain drew Rawlins' attention, and suddenly she was facing the Rustler leader himself. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, woman!" he snarled, firing rapidly. Martha ducked behind a water trough, feeling bullets splash into the metal. "Funny," she called back. "I was just thinking the same about you." She popped up, fired twice, and forced him to scramble for cover. The battle raged across the ranch. Martha's traps and preparations took their toll, but sheer numbers were beginning to tell. Smoke filled the air from multiple fires, and the sound of gunfire was nearly constant. Then came a sound that changed everything. Horse hooves, dozens of them approaching fast. Martha's heart leaped as she recognized the rhythm. Her message had gotten through. "Federal marshals!" a voice boomed across the ranch. "Drop your weapons!" The sudden arrival of law enforcement, real law enforcement, threw Rawlins' men into chaos. Some tried to flee, others surrendered on the spot. Rawlins himself made one last desperate attempt, charging toward Martha with gun blazing. She met him head-on, dodging his wild shots. Their final exchange was brief but violent. Martha's first shot knocked the gun from his hand. Her second caught him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. As the dust settled and the marshals rounded up the surviving rustlers, Martha stood over Rollins, her gun trained steadily on his chest. "You should have left my ranch alone," she said quietly. "What are you?" he gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Just a widow," she replied with a slight smile, "who learned a few tricks along the way." The town hall was packed to the rafters, every resident of the county having turned out for what promised to be the most dramatic meeting in living memory. Sheriff Calloway stood at the front, his badge still gleaming, but his confident demeanor had begun to crack around the edges. Martha walked in, her boots echoing on the wooden floor as conversations hushed. Behind her came two federal marshals, carrying a large leather satchel filled with documents. She'd spent years as a Pinkerton, learning that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun, but carefully gathered evidence. "Sheriff Calloway," she called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I believe it's time we had a public discussion about law enforcement in this county." Calloway's hand twitched near his gun, but the presence of the marshals kept him in check. "This is an official town meeting, Mrs. Whitaker. You have no authority here." "Actually," Martha replied, pulling out a folded document, "I do. This is my official reinstatement as a special investigator for the Pinkerton Agency, authorized to assist federal authorities in cases of corruption." A murmur ran through the crowd. Martha began laying out papers on the table before her. "Let's start with the evidence, shall we?" Bank records showing suspicious deposits to the sheriff's personal account, all coinciding with Rollins' major cattle thefts. Witness statements from ranch hands who were paid to look the other way, and most damning of all, letters in your own hand coordinating raids with Rollins. Calloway's face had gone pale. "These are lies! Fabrications!" "Are they?" Martha held up a leather-bound ledger. "This is Rollins' personal account book, recovered during the raid on my ranch. Notice the regular payments to someone listed only as Red? An interesting nickname for a law enforcement officer, wouldn't you say?" The crowd's murmur grew louder. Local business owners began standing up, calling out instances where Calloway had ignored their complaints about rustlers. Others shared stories of mysterious threats when they tried to investigate missing cattle. "You can't prove anything," Calloway snarled, but his voice had lost its authority. Martha stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "Actually, I already have. While you were busy plotting with Rollins, I was building a case. Every meeting, every transaction, every corrupt deal, all documented and verified. The federal marshals didn't just arrive by chance yesterday." The sheriff's composure finally broke. He drew his gun, but before he could level it, 3 deputies, men whose consciences had finally won out, tackled him to the ground. The badge that had been his shield of authority clattered across the floor, coming to rest at Martha's feet. As the marshals moved in to make the arrest, Martha addressed the stunned crowd. "This county deserves real law enforcement. People who will protect the innocent, not prey on them. It's time for a change." The citizens erupted in cheers and applause. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of justice long overdue. Martha watched as Calloway was led away in handcuffs, knowing that her work wasn't quite finished. There were still more corrupt officials to uncover, more wrongs to right. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first shots rang out across the W ranch. Jedediah Rollins, broken out of custody by his remaining loyal men, had returned for one final, desperate stand. The fury of a cornered animal blazed in his eyes as he led the charge toward the ranch house. "You've taken everything from me!" his voice boomed across the property. "Now I'm going to return the favor." Martha stood on her porch, calm despite the chaos erupting around her. She'd known this moment would come. Men like Rollins couldn't accept defeat gracefully, but this time she was more than ready. "Last chance, Jedediah," she called out. "There's no corrupt sheriff to protect you anymore, no badges to hide behind." His answer came in the form of renewed gunfire. His men had spread out, trying to surround the ranch house, but Martha had prepared for this final confrontation, using every trick she'd learned in her years as a Pinkerton. The battle unfolded like a deadly chess match. Every time Rollins' men tried to advance, they found their path blocked by carefully placed obstacles or caught in devastating crossfire from Martha and Dusty's positions. The ranch had become a fortress, each approach covered, each angle defended. "You think you're so clever," Rollins shouted, frustration evident in his voice. "But I've got nothing left to lose." Martha moved through her defensive positions with practiced efficiency, her shots finding their marks with deadly precision. She wasn't aiming to kill, that had never been her way. But each bullet disabled another attacker, gradually whittling down Rollins' forces. The turning point came when Rollins, enraged by his men's failures, decided to take matters into his own hands. He charged directly toward Martha's position, firing wildly, all pretense of strategy abandoned in his fury. Martha met his charge head-on. Their final duel played out in the dusty yard of the Double W, each movement a testament to their years of experience. Rollins was stronger, but Martha was faster, more disciplined. When his gun clicked empty, she could have ended it with a single shot. Instead, she kicked his weapon away and faced him with her own gun lowered. "It's over, Jedediah. Your empire's fallen. Your men are either captured or fled. Don't make me end this with more bloodshed." Rollins, his face twisted with rage and desperation, reached for a hidden knife. "It's never over," he snarled, lunging forward. Martha sidestepped his attack with the grace of her Pinkerton training, using his own momentum to throw him to the ground. Before he could recover, she had him pinned, her gun pressed firmly against his back. "Like I said," she spoke softly but with iron in her voice, "it's over." As federal marshals swarmed the property, taking Rollins and his remaining men into custody, Martha stood watching, her expression a mixture of relief and resolution. This final battle hadn't just been about defending her ranch. It had been about justice, about showing that one person standing up for what's right could make a difference. The county courthouse buzzed with anticipation as Jedediah Rollins was led in chains before the judge. Martha sat in the front row, watching as the man who had terrorized the territory for so long finally faced justice. The evidence she had gathered during her months of investigation lay spread across the prosecutor's table. Ledgers, letters, and witness statements that painted a damning picture of corruption and violence. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts," the jury foreman announced, his voice steady and clear. The courtroom erupted in cheers, years of fear and intimidation finally breaking like a fever. Outside, the town had taken on a festive atmosphere. Ranchers who had lost cattle to Rollins' gang shared stories and congratulations. Families who had lived in fear of midnight raids breathed easier. Martha found herself surrounded by people offering thanks and handshakes. "You did more than catch some rustlers," Marshal Thompson told her as they watched Rollins being led away to serve his sentence. "You gave these people back their dignity, their hope." Back at the Double W, Dusty had organized a crew to repair the damage from the final battle. The bullet holes and scorch marks were gradually disappearing, but Martha knew the ranch would never be quite the same. It had become a symbol of resistance, of one person's stand against corruption. "Never seen anything like it," Dusty said, joining her on the porch. "Way folks are talking, you'd think you were some kind of legend." Martha smiled, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. "No legend, Dusty. Just someone who couldn't stand by and watch injustice win." A rider approached from town, carrying news that made Martha's heart swell with pride. The county council had voted to establish a permanent law enforcement oversight committee, with Martha appointed as special advisor. Her experience as both a Pinkerton agent and a rancher made her uniquely qualified to help prevent future corruption. "What about the ranch?" Dusty asked, concerned in his voice. "You won't be leaving us, will you?" Martha shook her head, her hand resting on the porch railing her late husband had built. "This is my home, Dusty. The Double W is where I belong. But maybe it's time it became more than just a ranch." She shared her vision with him, using the Double W as a training ground for a new generation of law enforcement officers, teaching them not just about cattle and horses, but about justice, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. "Sounds like a mighty fine idea," Dusty nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Turn what Rawlins meant for evil into something good. As night fell over the Double W, Martha felt a deep sense of peace. The ranch had survived, justice had been served, and a new chapter was beginning. Her days as a Pinkerton agent had prepared her for this moment, but it was her love for this land and its people that would guide her forward. The morning sun painted the Double W ranch in shades of promise as Martha stood on her porch, watching Dusty work with a group of young deputies. 3 months had passed since Rawlins' conviction, and the ranch had transformed into something her late husband could never have imagined, a beacon of hope and justice for the entire territory. "Keep your eyes on the horizon," she heard Dusty instructing. "Trouble doesn't always announce itself with gunfire." The young man had taken to teaching naturally, sharing the skills Martha had passed on to him during their fight against Rawlins' gang. The ranch itself bore few visible scars from those violent days. New wood had replaced the bullet-riddled walls, fresh paint covered the scorched timbers, and the cattle grazed peacefully in pastures once threatened by rustlers. But the changes went deeper than mere repairs. A new building stood near the main house, a training facility where Martha shared her Pinkerton experience with law enforcement officers from across 3 territories. Her reputation had grown, drawing those who wanted to learn not just about tracking criminals, but about maintaining integrity in the face of corruption. "Mrs. Whitaker," called one of the ranch hands, approaching with an envelope in hand. "This just arrived by special courier." Martha recognized the seal immediately, the distinctive mark of the Pinkerton agency. Inside, she found a letter that made her breath catch. Reports of organized crime moving into the Northern Territories, rumors of corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. They needed her expertise once again. "Important news?" Dusty asked, joining her on the porch. "Could be," she replied, her mind already working through the implications. "Seems our work here might have been just the beginning." As if to emphasize her words, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, new recruits arriving for training. Among them, Martha noticed several women, their determination visible even at a distance. Times were changing, and the Double W was changing with them. Think Thomas would have ever imagined this? Dusty gestured to the bustling ranch, now as much an academy as a working cattle operation. Martha smiled, touching the wedding ring she still wore. He always said this land had a destiny. Maybe this is what he meant, a place where justice takes root and grows. Looking out over her transformed ranch, Martha felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Double W had become more than just a widow's legacy or a former Pinkerton agent's hideaway. It was a symbol of what one person could accomplish by standing firm against evil, by refusing to bow to intimidation or corruption. "Well," she said, tucking the letter into her pocket, "looks like we've got work to do." The sun climbed higher over the Double W ranch, illuminating a future bright with possibility. Martha Whitaker, widow, rancher, and defender of justice, stood ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing she'd found her true calling at last. If you thought this story was incredible, wait until you see what we have coming up next. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.